The stone walls of the prison tower were cold and unyielding, a silent reminder of the Alpha King's sudden fall. Once the ruler of a prosperous realm, he now sat restrained on a rough wooden bench, his wrists bound with coarse ropes, and his amber eyes flicking toward the heavy iron door with quiet determination. He had been captured by a rival clan, one that sought to destabilize the balance of power across the northern territories. Despite the chains and the isolation, the Alpha King did not despair. Strength was not measured by freedom alone, and he had learned from his earliest days the value of patience and strategy. He observed the guards as they paced the hall, noting their habits, their expressions, even the faint tremor of fatigue in their steps. Vigilance, he reminded himself, was as vital in captivity as it had been on the battlefield. Beyond the stone walls of the tower, a village lay in ruins. Smoke curled from collapsed homes, and the ground was scarred with the footprints of fleeing villagers. Among the remnants, a young woman moved cautiously. Her village had been raided, her family scattered, leaving her powerless in the face of overwhelming danger. She was small in stature, with silver-streaked hair that caught the fading light, and eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. Though she had no sword, no shield, and no claim to power, she felt a strange pull toward the tower. Something about the restrained Alpha King drew her attention, not his chains, but the quiet strength in his gaze. He was fierce even in captivity, and there was a nobility to his composure that suggested he was more than a mere prisoner. The Alpha King noticed the movement outside the barred window. His keen eyes caught the flicker of a figure pausing at the edge of the courtyard. Though she had not approached openly, the timing and hesitation suggested curiosity or perhaps desperation. He recognized the same spark he had seen in allies who would later prove indispensable. Courage tempered with caution, the young woman hesitated, heart pounding. She had come close enough to see him clearly now. He was unlike anyone she had encountered, upright, poised even in chains, and radiating a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding her. She wanted to turn away, to flee back to safety, but something rooted her in place. She felt powerless, yes, but also compelled to act. For several moments, they simply observed each other from a distance. The Alpha King studied her carefully, noting her hesitation, her awareness of danger, and the subtle signs of resilience in her posture. In another life, perhaps she would have been dismissed as inconsequential, but in this moment, her presence mattered. He sensed potential not in power, but in insight and courage. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying a weight that seemed to travel even through the thick stone walls. "Do not linger where you cannot protect yourself," he said. Though his tone was calm, it carried authority. Curiosity can be dangerous, yet it may also serve as a guide. Be cautious. The young woman's breath caught. His voice was firm but not commanding. It was a warning laced with understanding. She bowed her head slightly, acknowledging his words, then stepped back into the shadows, retreating to the relative safety of the ruined village. As she moved, her mind raced. Who was this man, restrained yet commanding? Why did his presence stir something within her, a mixture of fear, admiration, and the faintest glimmer of hope? She had lost so much, yet, for the first time in days, she felt a strange pull toward action, toward purpose, even if she could not yet define it. Inside the tower, the Alpha King leaned back slightly, his amber eyes thoughtful. He had been held captive before, and he understood the dynamics of fear, power, and influence. Yet this encounter, brief, silent, and fleeting, was unlike any other. The woman outside had no claim, no weapon, no immediate leverage, yet he sensed that her presence could become significant. Trust, he reflected, was often built in the smallest moments of observation, courage, and discernment. The day passed slowly. Guards came and went, carrying messages, food, or tools, each under the watchful gaze of the captive Alpha. He remained composed, maintaining a quiet dignity that unsettled those around him. Each movement, each word, each glance was kept out of fear, but as preparation for the inevitable opportunity to act. Meanwhile, the young woman ventured closer to the tower under the cover of evening. She had spent the day considering the Alpha King's words, reflecting on her own helplessness and questioning her instincts. What compelled her to approach? A dangerous enemy. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was a desire to witness courage firsthand, or perhaps it was the faint hope of making a difference, however small. As she drew near the barred window again, she noticed how the Alpha King's eyes seemed to meet hers even before she spoke. There was an understanding in that gaze, a silent acknowledgement that she was no longer invisible. Fear remained, but it was accompanied by a burgeoning sense of purpose. She had no power, yet she could act in ways that mattered by observing, by thinking, by choosing. The Alpha King inclined his head slightly. "You are brave to return," he said quietly. "But remember, courage without wisdom can be perilous. Observe, anticipate, and act with care." Her hands tightened slightly around a tattered piece of cloth she had found earlier. Though it was insignificant, it represented a first step, a small offering, a gesture of connection. She hesitated, then extended it toward the bars, her movements careful and deliberate. He accepted it with a nod, not as a sign of weakness, but as recognition of her initiative. "Small acts can carry weight," he said. "Even in powerlessness, one can shape outcomes with thought and intent." That night, as darkness enveloped the tower and the ruins outside, both the captive Alpha King and the young woman reflected on the encounter. He recognized in her a quiet strength, an intelligence, and a courage that, though untested in battle, could prove invaluable. She recognized in him a dignity and composure that inspired trust, even in a man bound by chains. For the first time since the capture, the Alpha King allowed himself a measure of hope. Perhaps the woman outside, though powerless by most standards, would become a key to his eventual freedom. And perhaps, in her quiet determination and courage, she would discover her own strength in ways she had never imagined. The night air carried a chill, but within the hearts of both, a spark had ignited one of trust, of understanding, and of the possibility that even the powerless and the captive could change the course of fate when courage met opportunity. And so, the story began not with swords or battle cries, but with a glance, a cautious approach, and the quiet recognition of potential in the most unlikely of allies. The morning sun filtered weakly through the clouds, casting pale light across the ruined village. Smoke lingered in the air, and the acrid scent of charred wood clung to her clothes. The young woman moved cautiously among the debris, her heart heavy with the losses she had endured. Families scattered, homes destroyed, livelihoods lost. She had nowhere to turn, and no power to defend herself against the violence that had descended upon her home. Yet despite the devastation, her thoughts kept returning to the tower. The restrained figure she had seen the night before, the Alpha King, haunted her mind. There was something in his posture, his calm, commanding presence even in chains, that stirred a strange mixture of fear, curiosity, and admiration. She had no weapon, no army, and no right to intervene. Yet the pull to act or at least observe was irresistible. She wandered along the outskirts of the village, staying hidden behind ruined walls and fallen beams. The morning was eerily silent, the usual chatter of villagers replaced by an oppressive stillness. As she approached the tower, she saw guards patrolling methodically, their movements confident and practiced. They were not cruel men, yet their authority was absolute, and she understood immediately that she could not confront them openly. Any attempt at power would be futile. Her hands clenched at her sides, the sensation of helplessness pressing upon her. She was a stranger in a land rife with conflict, a powerless observer in a world ruled by strength and strategy. Yet, as she crouched behind a broken stone wall and observed the guards, she realized that even without strength, there were ways to act. She could watch, learn, and wait. She could make choices small, deliberate actions that might influence events in subtle but meaningful ways. The Alpha King shifted in his cell, his amber eyes scanning the courtyard, sharp and vigilant. He noticed her presence immediately, though she remained hidden. There was a spark of recognition in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement that she had returned despite her fear. Courage, he thought, was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, measured, and deliberate. And here was someone who possessed that quiet courage, even in the face of overwhelming helplessness. For several moments, they simply regarded each other from a distance. She studied his face, noting the calm determination etched in his features. His composure was not arrogance, but the product of experience and unshakable self-discipline. She felt a pang of awe and unease. He was powerful, yes, but also human. Vulnerable, yet resilient. She had expected fear, perhaps even weakness, but saw none. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could she do something to help him? Could her small actions, watching, observing, delivering minor assistance, make a difference? She had no skills in combat, no knowledge of tactics, and no allies. Yet she sensed that even a powerless person could influence events through careful thought and courage. Summoning her resolve, she edged closer to the tower's shadowed side, keeping low and moving silently. Her pulse quickened, but she reminded herself to breathe steadily, to observe rather than act impulsively. One small slip could draw the guard's attention, or worse, bring danger upon herself. Yet even in fear, she felt a strange thrill at the beginning of purpose, of agency in a world where she had felt utterly powerless. She paused at the base of the tower, peering up through a narrow gap in the stonework. The Alpha King's amber eyes met hers again. This time, there was a subtle shift in his gaze, curiosity, but also encouragement. Though they had not spoken more than a few cautious words, he seemed to recognize her potential, her courage, and the fact that her presence mattered more than her lack of strength. It was in this moment that she realized the truth. Power was not always measured by weapons, armies, or authority. Sometimes power came from observation, intelligence, and the willingness to act with thought and purpose, even in the face of danger. She may have been powerless in the conventional sense, but she could make choices more, deliberate actions that could tip the balance. She stayed hidden until the guard's footsteps receded. Then, cautiously, she approached the tower's entrance, careful not to draw attention. She found a loose stone near the base of the wall and slipped a small piece of cloth through the narrow gap. It was tattered and insignificant, but it was a gesture, silent offering, a signal that she had returned, and that she was beginning to act in her own subtle way inside the tower. The Alpha King noticed the cloth and accepted it with a small nod. Though it was a minor act, it carried significance. He had been observing her movements, noting her courage, her intelligence, and the way she considered risk and consequence. He recognized the beginning of a bond one formed, not through strength or dominance, but through mutual awareness and the shared understanding of vulnerability. The young woman retreated into the shadows, heart racing. She felt fear, yes, but also a newfound sense of purpose. She had no weapons, no allies, and no immediate power, yet she had acted. She had contributed, in a small but meaningful way, to the situation that had dominated her thoughts for days. She had begun to transform her helplessness into subtle influencer. First step toward courage, The Alpha King settled back on his bench, amber eyes reflective. He considered her actions, the way she had approached danger carefully, yet with deliberate intent. He understood the importance of such quiet courage. It was the kind of bravery that could not be forced or taught, only recognized and nurtured. In her, he saw potential, not merely as someone who could assist him in his captivity, but as someone who could grow into a partner capable of understanding strategy, resilience, and insight. The morning passed slowly. Guards came and went, and the young woman observed from hidden vantage points. Each movement, each choice, and each interaction, though minor in isolation, was an opportunity to learn, to act, and to strengthen the connection forming between them. She began to anticipate the guards' routines, note patterns in their behavior, and consider ways she might aid him in the future. By afternoon, she found herself sitting in the shade of a ruined wall, notebook in hand, jotting down observations. She wrote about the guards, the tower, and the subtle cues that might indicate opportunity. Though she was powerless in a physical sense, she realized that intelligence, foresight, and careful observation were forms of strength that could not be ignored. Night fell, bringing with it the cool whisper of the wind and the quiet hush of the ruined village. The young woman returned once more to the tower's shadowed side. She had no plans to confront anyone, no desire to draw attention, but she wanted to witness the Alpha King one last time before resting. He looked at her through the window, amber eyes meeting hers. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between them, a recognition of courage, of potential, and of the quiet power found in observation, resilience, and determination. Though they had not shared a word beyond cautious greetings, a connection had formed. "You have courage," he said softly, his voice carrying across the gap. "Even in powerlessness, one can act in ways that matter. Observe, anticipate, and act carefully. You have the potential to influence more than you know." She nodded silently, heart pounding, understanding his words in a way that transcended language. They did not need to speak further. The message was clear. Power could take many forms, and even the powerless could act with purpose, courage, and foresight. That night, as she lay in the remnants of her destroyed home, the young woman reflected on her actions. She had come close to the tower, approached the Alpha King, and acted, albeit subtly, in a situation that had once seemed entirely beyond her control. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She had begun to transform her helplessness into influence. And with each day, each careful observation, and each small action, she would grow stronger not in weapons, but in insight, wisdom, and determination that and far above. Within the cold stone tower, the Alpha King watched the shadows with quiet satisfaction. He understood that she was not yet an ally in the traditional sense, but her presence, intelligence, and courage marked the beginning of something significant. In a world dominated by strength, he had found in her a spark, a reminder that even the powerless could shape the fate of kings, kingdoms, and the very course of destiny itself. Dawn broke over the ruined village, casting pale light across charred rooftops and shattered streets. The young woman moved quietly among the debris, her steps careful, measured, and deliberate. Though she had nothing but determination and curiosity, the thought of the Alpha King in captivity drew her forward. She had watched him through the shadows for days, noting guard patterns, timing their shifts, and understanding the subtle routines of the tower. Each observation brought clarity, each small act a sense of purpose. Today, she resolved, would be different. She would attempt the first real contact, bridging the distance that had separated them. She carried a small scrap of cloth, a token of comfort she hoped would reach him, and a handful of bread wrapped carefully in the remnants of her shawl. It was a humble offering, but it was an act of courage, a first step toward connection. The tower loomed above her as she approached cautiously. The guards moved predictably, as she had noted, their attention divided between patrols and idle conversations. Timing her approach, she crouched behind a fallen wall and waited, watching their patterns. When the moment came, she crept to the base of the tower and slipped the cloth and bread through the narrow gap at the bottom of the barred window. The Alpha King noticed immediately. His amber eyes, sharp and alert even after days of confinement, met the small gift with quiet approval. He understood the courage it had taken for her to approach, and though the gesture was small, it marked the beginning of communication, a bridge between prisoner and observer. "You are brave to come so close," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of respect. "But remember, even small acts can be dangerous if done without care." She nodded, heart racing, but remained silent. Words were not needed yet. Their connection was forming in gestures, observation, and the quiet understanding of intent. She retreated slightly, watching him carefully as he examined the offerings. The Alpha King accepted the bread and cloth with deliberate calm. "Thank you," he said. "You have shown thoughtfulness, and that is a rare strength. Even powerless, your actions can make a difference. Remember this." For several moments, they simply observed each other. The young woman's fear was tempered by curiosity, and the Alpha King's presence, though restrained, radiated a steady authority that drew her in. She realized that courage was not only about strength or weapons, it was about persistence, observation, and careful choices. Days passed in a pattern of careful observation and subtle exchanges. The young woman would leave small items for the Alpha King: water, scraps of food, notes indicating changes in guard rotations, or the occasional observation about patrols. Each act was simple, yet meaningful. She began to notice his gratitude expressed in subtle gestures: a nod, a focused glance, or the way he seemed to anticipate her visits. The Alpha King, in turn, began to test her understanding. Through small hints and gestures, he gauged her perception, her attention to detail, and her ability to act thoughtfully under pressure. He had learned long ago that allies came in many forms, and even a powerless observer could become invaluable if guided properly. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the tower courtyard, the young woman observed the Alpha King through a narrow slit in the wall. A guard had moved unpredictably, threatening to uncover her hidden position. She froze, heart pounding, unsure whether to retreat or act. The Alpha King noticed her hesitation, his amber eyes locking with hers, and he inclined his head slightly, a signal of understanding and patience. Gathering her courage, she stayed her ground, letting the guard pass without incident. The Alpha King's expression softened, conveying approval without words. Through this silent exchange, they began to establish trust, understanding that courage, observation, and patience were as important as any action. That evening, as the village lay quiet under the silver glow of the moon, the young woman made her way back to the tower one last time before nightfall. She knelt beside the wall, leaving a note written on a scrap of parchment. "I see your strength, and I will help in the ways I can. Even small actions matter." The Alpha King read it carefully, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. He understood her intent, her courage, and the growing bond of trust forming between them. Even in powerlessness, he whispered to himself, "She has found strength." The next day, a subtle shift occurred. The Alpha King began leaving signs for her, a folded piece of cloth indicating the safest path to approach the tower, a small mark on a wall to signal the best timing for her visits. Through these quiet signals, they began to communicate more deliberately, forming a rhythm of trust and cooperation. The young woman marveled at the thoughtfulness of the Alpha King, Though captive, he guided her carefully, teaching her the nuances of observation, timing, and decision-making. She began to understand that power was not merely in physical strength, but in foresight, strategy, and the ability to act with wisdom. Together, they began to plan small strategies, moving items subtly, noting guard rotations, and leaving messages that could influence events without alerting anyone to their cooperation. Each successful exchange strengthened their bond, not through words of friendship or affection, but through respect, trust, and shared understanding. One evening, as she crouched in her hidden vantage point, she realized that fear had begun to give way to confidence. She could see the Alpha King more clearly now, noting the subtle tension in his posture when guards approached and the calm determination that never left his gaze. She understood his strategy before he acted, anticipating movements and providing silent support. The Alpha King, in turn, recognized her growing competence. She was no longer simply an observer. She had become a partner in subtle strategy, capable of influencing outcomes in ways that required intelligence, courage, and discernment. He felt a quiet satisfaction in watching her develop, realizing that even the powerless could wield significant influence through careful thought and decisive action. By the end of the week, a rhythm had been established. The young woman left small gifts and observations. The Alpha King responded with guidance and acknowledgement. Through these exchanges, they built the foundation of mutual trust, a bond stronger than words, forged in quiet courage, shared observation, and the recognition of each other's potential. Late one night, as the moonlight bathed the tower courtyard, the young woman lingered in the shadows, reluctant to leave. The Alpha King's amber eyes caught hers, and he inclined his head in a gesture of quiet reassurance. No words were spoken, yet understanding passed between them. They were allies now, bound by trust, intelligence, and courage. "I will continue," she whispered softly, though he could not hear. "Even powerless, I will act. I will learn. I will help." The Alpha King's gaze lingered on her, amber eyes reflecting approval, respect, and hope. He understood that their journey had only begun, and that together they could navigate the dangers ahead. Even in captivity, he had found an ally who could see, understand, and act, a partner whose courage complemented his strength. As the young woman retreated to the safety of the ruined village, she felt a quiet determination take root. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by purpose. She realized that even the smallest acts of courage could influence events, and that trust, once earned, could become a powerful force in the tower above. The Alpha King settled back on the wooden bench, amber eyes thoughtful. He had been captured, restrained, and isolated. Yet in the quiet presence of the young woman, he saw a glimmer of possibility, a reminder that alliances could form in the most unlikely circumstances, and that power was not always measured in chains or swords. And so, their partnership began not with grand gestures or overt power, but with courage, observation, and trust. Each small act of bravery, each subtle communication, laid the groundwork for what would become a powerful alliance, capable of overcoming captivity, adversity, and the threats that lay ahead. The morning mist clung to the ruined village like a soft veil, diffusing the pale light of dawn across collapsed roofs and blackened timbers. The young woman moved quietly through the debris, her steps careful, deliberate. She had learned much over the past days watching the Alpha King, observing the guards, and finding ways to act despite her lack of weapons or allies. Each action, however small, carried weight, shaping a delicate rhythm of trust between herself and the captive king. Though powerless in the conventional sense, she understood now that courage came in many forms. It was not always a sword raised in battle. It could be thoughtfulness, careful observation, and the ability to act decisively when others overlooked opportunity. She carried a small basket with scraps of bread, a vial of water, and a folded cloth, tokens of sustenance and comfort. She could offer him without exposing herself to danger. From a hidden vantage point near the base of the tower, she studied the god's movements. Each step, each glance, each idle pause told a story. She noticed small habits. One guard favored the left side of the courtyard while patrolling. Another glanced repeatedly at a crack in the wall. These were minor details, but they mattered. She jotted them carefully in her notebook, creating a pattern she could follow, and using it to ensure that her visits would remain undetected. When the moment came, she approached the tower, kneeling at the base and slipping the offerings through the narrow gap at the bottom of the barred window. The Alpha King noticed immediately, his amber eyes scanning her movements with calm approval. Though he was confined, he understood the significance of small gestures. Each act of courage, no matter how minor, strengthened the bond forming between them. "You are growing bolder," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of respect. "Each action you take demonstrates thoughtfulness. You are learning to act despite fear, and that is a form of power often overlooked." She nodded silently, retreating to the shadows before the guards could notice. Her pulse was quick, but her mind was steady. Each act reinforced a lesson she was beginning to internalize. Courage and strategy were intertwined. Even small, seemingly insignificant choices could shape outcomes in ways that might be crucial in the future. Over the following days, the young woman found additional ways to support him. She noticed patterns in the guards' patrols, recorded changes in routine, and even left small, innocuous messages, arrows, marked with chalk, to indicate the safest times to approach. Each act required careful observation and precise timing, and with each success, her confidence grew. The Alpha King, in turn, began responding with subtle cues. He left folded scraps of cloth, indicating when to approach, and small marks signaling changes in the guard's behavior. Through this quiet exchange, they communicated without words, learning to trust one another. Each action built on the last, creating a silent rhythm of cooperation and understanding. One afternoon, she spotted a guard who had deviated from the usual patrol pattern, moving suspiciously close to her hidden vantage point. Fear surged through her, and for a moment, she froze. The Alpha King's eyes met hers through the bars, amber gaze steady and reassuring. A slight nod told her to remain calm, to trust her observation, and to act with care, with deliberate precision. She stayed in the shadows, waiting until the guard moved away. The tension eased, and she realized that courage was not the absence of fear, it was the ability to act in spite of it. The Alpha King had seen her hesitate, yet his confidence in her judgment bolstered her own, reinforcing the trust between them. Each act of courage, though small, carried consequences. She left a fresh scrap of bread one morning, noticing that a guard had taken an unusually long route past the tower. The Alpha King nodded subtly, understanding her attention to detail. Together, through careful observation and quiet action, they began to influence events without ever directly confronting the guards. Her courage grew not only in action, but in thought. She began anticipating challenges, considering the best approach to each day's tasks, and weighing the risks of exposure. Each successful action reinforced the lessons she had learned about vigilance, patience, and strategic thinking. The Alpha King's mentorship, though indirect, guided her development, transforming fear into purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the courtyard, she approached the tower with a small vial of water. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation of another subtle test of courage. She knelt, placing the vial carefully through the gap, and stepped back into the shadows. The Alpha King's eyes met hers, amber gaze, steady and approving. He understood the courage required for even this minor act. "Each gesture you make is meaningful," he said softly. "Your careful thought and willingness to act, despite risk, demonstrates a strength beyond what you may realize. You are learning to turn powerlessness into influence." Her heart lifted at his words. It was not praise for bravery in battle, but recognition of thoughtfulness, foresight, and determination. She had no sword, no army, and no claim to authority. Yet through patience and careful action, she had begun to wield a quiet power. Over time, their silent communication deepened. She began leaving notes that indicated observations or minor suggestions, and he responded with guidance, subtly directing her actions without revealing his full plan. Each exchange strengthened their understanding, their trust, and their shared commitment to the future. One night, as the village lay in quiet darkness, she lingered near the tower, reflecting on the day's events. The Alpha King's amber eyes met hers one last time before she retreated, and she felt a sense of accomplishment she had never known. Courage was no longer an abstract concept. It was tangible, demonstrated in each careful movement, each thoughtful observation, each deliberate choice. She understood now that even the powerless could shape events. Small acts of courage, performed consistently and with attention to detail, could influence outcomes and create opportunities. The Alpha King had recognized her potential, guiding her through quiet observation and subtle instruction, allowing her to grow in confidence and insight. From within the tower, the Alpha King watched her retreat into the shadows. He recognized the transformation occurring before his eyes, a timid, powerless observer evolving into a thoughtful, courageous participant in the subtle strategies unfolding around them. Each act, no matter how small, reflected not only her intelligence but her developing capacity to act under pressure, anticipate challenges, and influence outcomes. Through these small acts of courage, a bond had formed, one built not on words of friendship or affection, but on trust, respect, and the shared understanding of risk, strategy, and resilience. They had discovered that true strength often lay not in dominance or weaponry, but in observation, thoughtfulness, and the willingness to act despite fear. As the night settled over the village, she retreated to a ruined building for rest. Fear lingered, but it had been tempered by purpose. Each small gesture had meaning, each quiet act carried weight, and each decision reinforced her growing confidence. She had begun to see herself not as powerless, but as someone capable of shaping events in meaningful ways. In the tower above, the Alpha King leaned back against the wooden bench, amber eyes thoughtful. He understood that her journey had only just begun, yet he had already witnessed the emergence of courage, intelligence, and resilience in someone who had seemed powerless. Even in captivity, he found hope in her development, recognizing that alliances were built in small moments of trust, observation, and quiet action. And so through acts as subtle as leaving bread, notes, or a vial of water, a silent partnership was forged. The Alpha King and the young woman had begun to navigate the complexities of danger together, learning that courage, vigilance, and thoughtfulness could overcome even the greatest obstacles. Powerlessness, she realized, was not a limitation, it was an opportunity to act with intelligence, care, and courage. The rhythm of their alliance settled into a quiet pattern: observe, act, respond, and adapt. Each day strengthened their bond, each small act of courage reinforced trust, and each exchange created the foundation for strategies yet to come. Even in the shadow of captivity, they had found strength in each other, a reminder that courage, no matter how quiet, could shape destinies. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint smoke from the ruined village. The young woman moved with quiet purpose, each step measured and deliberate. Over the past days, she had observed, learned, and acted, leaving small offerings, noting the guard's habits, and establishing a rhythm of silent communication with the Alpha King. Each gesture, no matter how minor, had strengthened their bond and built a foundation of trust. This morning, however, there was something different. She carried not only food and water, but a carefully folded piece of parchment, on which she had sketched a rough map of the tower, the surrounding courtyard, and the guards' patrol routes. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. Today, they would begin their first tentative planning, not through words spoken aloud, but through gestures and notes that conveyed strategy and intent. The Alpha King observed her approach from the barred window, amber eyes, sharp and assessing. He noticed the parchment and the way she held it with care, and he inclined his head slightly. Though he remained in captivity, he had learned long ago that even the smallest minds could grasp strategy when guided thoughtfully. Her courage and intelligence had already impressed him, and he understood that the time had come to begin subtle coordination. She knelt at the base of the tower, slipping the parchment carefully through the gap at the bottom of the bars. The Alpha King retrieved it, examining the crude sketches and annotations. The lines were uneven, the handwriting small, but the observations were accurate. Guard rotations, blind spots, and small weaknesses in the patrol patterns. A faint smile touched his lips. "You have an eye for detail," he whispered, though his voice carried authority even in its softness. "These observations are useful. We can begin to consider opportunities. Timing, patience, and observation will be our greatest allies." She nodded silently, retreating to the shadows, heart pounding. Though she could not hear him, nor he her words, the exchange was meaningful. Through careful planning and subtle cues, they could begin to coordinate efforts without alerting the guards. Each successful act of observation and note-leaving strengthened their shared understanding and built a rhythm of cooperation. Over the next few days, they refined their system. She left small marks on stones and walls to indicate safe paths, timing her visits according to the guards' patrol patterns. The Alpha King responded with subtle gestures, a piece of cloth indicating which areas were safest to approach, a small mark signaling changes in the guards' routine. Through these quiet exchanges, a plan began to take shape, one that relied on patience, careful observation, and the courage to act despite fear. The young woman began to anticipate challenges. She noticed patterns in the guards' behavior, the way one lingered near the tower at noon, how another preferred to patrol in pairs at sunset, and the subtle cues that indicated when attention might waver. Each observation was recorded meticulously, folded into small notes, and left for the Alpha King to review. He, in turn, began to guide her more directly, using subtle cues to suggest actions or highlight opportunities. A folded piece of cloth might indicate that a guard would be momentarily distracted. A chalk mark could signal the best time to approach. They began to communicate almost seamlessly, building a rhythm of trust and cooperation that transcended words. One evening, as the village lay in quiet darkness and the moon cast silver light across the courtyard, the Alpha King and the young woman engaged in their first coordinated action. She observed a guard lingering near the tower, poised to change the patrol pattern. Following his subtle small fold in the cloth she had left, she remained hidden until the guard passed, leaving the area clear. The Alpha King acknowledged the success with a subtle nod, amber eyes reflecting approval and encouragement. Through these small acts, a tentative plan began to emerge. They would not attempt an escape immediately. The risk was too great, but they could prepare, gather intelligence, and identify opportunities for future action. Each successful coordination strengthened their bond, built confidence, and demonstrated that even in captivity, strategy and cooperation could influence outcomes. The young woman marveled at how the Alpha King guided her. Though he remained confined, he had a remarkable ability to anticipate challenges, assess risk, and instruct without revealing too much. She realized that intelligence and courage were as vital as physical strength, and that her careful observation and thoughtful action could be powerful tools in their shared endeavor. One afternoon, she discovered a subtle weakness in the tower's construction, a loose stone near the base that could be moved without attracting attention. She marked it carefully in her notes, leaving it for the Alpha King to consider. His amber eyes caught the detail immediately, and he allowed a small smile to show. "Excellent observation," he murmured. "Even small details can be pivotal. You are learning to think like a strategist." Her confidence grew with each successful observation, each small act of courage, and each subtle exchange. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by purpose and insight. She began to see herself not as powerless, but as someone capable of influencing outcomes, shaping strategy, and supporting the Alpha King in ways that mattered. The Alpha King, for his part, noted her growth with quiet satisfaction. Her intelligence, attention to detail, and willingness to act despite fear made her an invaluable ally, even from outside the tower. He understood that the plan would succeed not through haste or force, but through patience, cooperation, and the careful cultivation of trust. Together, they refined the timing of each approach, the placement of notes, and the subtle signals that guided action. They learned to anticipate each other's thoughts and movements, creating a rhythm of coordination that became increasingly seamless. Through observation, patience, and courage, they were transforming a powerless alliance into a strategic force capable of influencing events from within and beyond the tower walls. By nightfall, they had completed a preliminary plan. It was not an escape yet, but a preparation, a framework of observation, communication, and subtle action that could one day allow the Alpha King to regain freedom. They had built trust, strengthened courage, and discovered the power of strategy in a world dominated by physical strength. The young woman returned to her shelter in the ruined village, heart racing with anticipation and quiet pride. She had learned that courage was measured not in battle, but in observation, patience, and the willingness to act thoughtfully. She had begun to turn powerlessness into influence, and each success reinforced her growing confidence. From the tower, the Alpha King watched the village below, amber eyes reflective. He understood that their partnership had taken root not through strength, but through trust, intelligence, and quiet courage. The plan that emerged was modest, yet promising a reminder that, even in captivity, careful preparation and cooperation could create the conditions for success. And so, a plan began to form, delicate yet resilient. Each small act of courage, each careful observation, and each silent exchange contributed to the foundation of strategy that would one day free him. The young woman, once powerless and timid, had become an essential partner in shaping the events to come. Their alliance, built in secrecy, patience, and careful action, was growing stronger with each day. Trust had been established, courage had been cultivated, and the first outlines of a strategy had emerged. Though danger remained ever present, they had learned that even the smallest contributions could influence outcomes, and that patience, intelligence, and cooperation were as vital as any sword or shield. Together, through quiet observation, subtle communication, and acts of courage, they had begun the journey toward freedom, one deliberate step at a time. The dawn was fragile. Delicate streaks of light, painting the ruined village in soft gold and grey. The young woman moved carefully through the debris, carrying the small basket of bread, water, and cloth, as she had done for days. But today was different. Today was not just about observation or small acts of courage. It was the first time she and the Alpha King would put a tentative part of their plan into action. She approached the tower quietly, heart pounding, aware that any misstep could bring disaster. The guards were in their usual positions, but she had studied them closely. She knew their patterns, their habits, and their occasional lapses in attention. Every step had been considered, every detail noted in her small notebook. She understood the importance of timing, patience, and subtlety. Inside the tower, the Alpha King's amber eyes flicked to her approaching figure. He recognized the change in her posture, purposeful, careful, but confident. He nodded slightly, acknowledging that the first real step of their plan was underway. Even in chains, he could sense the subtle shift. They were moving from observation to action. The young woman knelt at the base of the tower and slipped the offerings and a folded note through the gap at the bottom of the bars. The note outlined a simple test, a small movement to see if a guard could be subtly distracted, allowing the Alpha King to adjust his position inside the tower. The Alpha King read the note carefully. It was not complex, just a simple instruction designed to test their coordination and her ability to act under pressure. He studied the guards and the tower layout and determined the optimal timing. His mind mapped out contingencies. What if a guard noticed her? What if the plan failed? Each outcome was considered, each response prepared. When the moment came, she executed her part with careful precision. She dropped a small rock at a distance, designed to create a harmless sound that would draw the attention of a nearby guard. Her heart raced as she watched the man pause, glance toward the noise, and then continue on his way, unaware of her true position. Inside the tower, the Alpha King shifted slightly, responding to the minor distraction. It was a small movement, but significant, a test of their ability to influence events subtly without drawing attention. His amber eyes met hers through the barred window, and he gave the faintest nod of approval. She had succeeded in executing the first coordinated step. Over the next hour, they repeated small actions. She created minor distractions, observed responses, and left notes indicating changes in guard positions. Each success reinforced their understanding. Each minor setback provided lessons in timing and strategy. Through these coordinated acts, they were building not just a plan, but a rhythm of trust, communication, and cooperation. The young woman marveled at how carefully the Alpha King guided her. Though confined, he had a remarkable ability to anticipate risk, instruct subtly, and respond to unforeseen challenges. She realized that courage was not merely action, it was patience, foresight, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. Even in powerlessness, she was beginning to feel the strength of influence. At one point, a guard noticed a small scrap of cloth she had left as a signal. Panic surged in her chest, but she froze and remained motionless. The Alpha King's amber eyes met hers, steady and reassuring, and she understood instantly. Patience, stillness, and trust were as important as any action. The guard glanced briefly and moved on, oblivious to the exchange occurring just beyond his awareness. By afternoon, the first attempt had yielded several successes. They had coordinated subtle movements, influenced guard behavior, and confirmed that their silent communication could work even under observation. Each small victory strengthened their confidence and deepened their bond, demonstrating that even a powerless ally could affect outcomes in meaningful ways. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the young woman reflected on the day. Her fear had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by purpose, preparation, and a growing understanding of strategy. She had executed actions under pressure, anticipated risk, and learned from each minor challenge. Courage, she realized, was as much about thoughtfulness and careful action as it was about boldness. Inside the tower, the Alpha King leaned back on the wooden bench, amber eyes thoughtful. He had been captured, restrained, and isolated, yet the first test of their plan had succeeded. He recognized her growth, careful observation, courage under pressure, and the ability to act with thought and precision. Even in captivity, she was proving to be a valuable ally, capable of contributing meaningfully to a strategy that could one day free him. The success of the first attempt brought with it new confidence, but also the realization that caution remained paramount. They were still vulnerable, and any misstep could undo progress. Yet the day had demonstrated the power of careful coordination, trust, and courage even in the absence of traditional strength or weaponry. The young woman returned to her shelter in the village, heart still racing but tempered by pride and purpose. She had acted despite fear, influenced events subtly, and contributed to a plan larger than herself. She began to understand that even small actions, when guided by careful thought and trust, could create meaningful change. That night, as she lay among the ruins, she considered the next steps. The first attempt had been a tester, small experiment in coordination, timing, and trust. The successes had been modest, yet they provided a foundation upon which to build. She was no longer merely an observer. She was a participant, capable of influencing events and contributing to a strategy that could alter the course of the Alpha King's captivity. The Alpha King, watching the village from his tower, reflected on the young woman's courage and growth. She had learned to act despite fear, to anticipate challenges, and to understand subtle strategy. Even powerless, she had become a partner capable of meaningful influence. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the foundation of trust and cooperation they had built could now support more ambitious plans in the days to come. The night air was cool, and the village lay silent. But within the shadows, a quiet partnership had begun to transform into a strategy, a plan that relied not on brute force, but on courage, intelligence, and subtle coordination. The first attempt had succeeded, demonstrating that even the powerless could contribute to shaping events, and that trust and patience were as valuable as any sword or shield. As dawn approached, the young woman closed her eyes briefly, reflecting on the lessons of the day. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act thoughtfully despite it. Observation, patience, and subtlety were powerful tools, and even small acts could influence outcomes in ways she had never imagined. She had taken the first step toward transforming powerlessness into meaningful action, and the Alpha King's guidance had been invaluable in teaching her the nuances of strategy, timing, and trust. Inside the tower, the Alpha King remained vigilant. He understood that the first attempt was only the beginning, but it had proven that their silent communication and careful coordination could work. Even in chains, he had found a partner capable of courage, intelligence, and foresight, a reminder that alliances could be formed in the most unlikely circumstances, and that influence did not always require traditional power. And so, the first attempt ended successfully, not with escape, confrontation, or grand gestures, but with subtle action, careful coordination, and quiet courage. Together, they had learned that power could take many forms, and that trust, patience, and thoughtful action could shape outcomes in ways even captivity could not entirely prevent. The young woman had become more than a powerless observer. She was a participant in strategy, a contributor to change, and a companion in the Alpha King's journey. And the Alpha King, even confined by chains, had found in her a source of insight, courage, and trust proof that even small acts of courage could pave the way for freedom, strategy, and eventual victory. The village was unusually quiet that morning. A thin fog lingered over the ruins, muffling sound and casting a muted grey light across broken rooftops and crumbling walls. The young woman moved carefully through the debris, her notebook clutched in one hand, her basket of small offerings in the other. The successes of the previous days had given her confidence, yet she was acutely aware that danger could strike without warning. She approached the tower with deliberate caution, noting the guards' movements and subtle changes in their routine. Even the smallest deviation, a glance, a pause, a shift in posture could signal risk. Observation had become her greatest weapon, but the fog obscured the familiar details she had come to rely upon. Inside the tower, the Alpha King noticed the fog as well, amber eyes scanning the courtyard and surrounding village. He could sense her approach, even without hearing her steps. Subtle shifts in shadows and the faint rustle of movement told him that she was near. He understood immediately that the fog could complicate their plan. Increasing the chance of detection, the young woman knelt at the base of the tower, slipping the day's offerings and a folded note through the gap at the bottom of the bars. The note outlined adjustments to the previous plan, minor changes in timing and movement to accommodate the reduced visibility. She hoped her observations had been accurate and that the Alpha King would understand the subtle cues. He read the note carefully, noting her attention to detail. The fog posed a challenge, but it also presented an opportunity. Movements that might be noticed in clear light could now be obscured. He adjusted his own position within the tower and prepared to respond to the subtle distractions she might create. Coordination, he knew, would require patience, precision, and trust. The first test came almost immediately. A patrolling guard veered unexpectedly toward her hidden location. Panic threatened to surge in her chest, but she froze and relied on her observations. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, seeking the optimal course of action. The Alpha King's amber gaze met hers through the barred window, a steady signal to remain calm and act with caution. Using a small pebble, she created a soft noise at a distance, drawing the guard's attention away without exposing her position. She held her breath as the man paused, glanced toward the sound, and then moved on. A wave of relief washed over her, tempered by the awareness that each action carried consequences. Even a minor misstep could alert the guards and jeopardize the plan. Inside the tower, the Alpha King responded to the subtle distraction, shifting slightly to take advantage of the moment. Though it was a minor movement, it was significant. It demonstrated that their coordination could work even under less than ideal conditions. Amber eyes met hers, conveying approval and encouragement. Trust had been established through these small but critical acts. As the morning progressed, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing hidden details that had been obscured. The young woman noticed a loose stone in the tower wall previously hidden, that could potentially provide an alternate approach if needed. She marked it in her notebook and left a small note for the Alpha King, careful to avoid detection. The Alpha King examined the note and the sketch. The stone could indeed provide an opportunity, but it would require precise timing and subtle execution. He began to consider contingencies, anticipating the guards' reactions and evaluating potential risks. Even in captivity, he could strategize, and with her careful observations, the young woman was becoming an integral part of that process. Later in the day, an unforeseen complication arose. A new guard had joined the patrolman with sharp eyes and a tendency to notice subtle movements. The young woman recognized immediately that this change required adaptation. She adjusted her plan, leaving an alternate note for the Alpha King and using minor distractions to test the guard's attention. Each action had to be measured, precise, and deliberate. The new guard approached more closely than expected, and for a tense moment, detection seemed inevitable. She froze, relying on everything she had learned: observation, patience, and trust in the Alpha King's guidance. He signaled through a subtle gesture, amber eyes, steady and calm, instructing her to remain hidden until the guard passed. The man eventually moved on, oblivious to the silent coordination occurring just beyond his awareness. The young woman exhaled quietly, feeling the tension drain from her body. Each successful maneuver reinforced her understanding of courage, patience, and the power of subtle action. Even in the face of unseen dangers, careful observation and trust could guide her safely through the challenges. That evening, as the village lay quiet under the setting sun, the Alpha King and the young woman reflected on the day's events through their silent communication. Each obstacle, each unexpected variable, had been an opportunity to adapt, learn, and strengthen their coordination. They had faced unseen dangers and had succeeded through observation, trust, and measured action. The young woman began to understand that courage was not merely the willingness to act, but the ability to remain composed in uncertainty, to anticipate challenges, and to adapt strategies in real time. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by insight and experience. She was growing into a thoughtful, capable partner in the Alpha King's efforts, and each day reinforced her confidence. Inside the tower, the Alpha King watched her retreat to the safety of the village, amber eyes reflective. He recognized her growth, careful observation, adaptability, and courage under pressure. Even in captivity, he had found a partner capable of understanding strategy, anticipating challenges, and influencing outcomes in meaningful ways. He allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, knowing that their silent partnership was becoming stronger with each passing day. Night fell, and the young woman reviewed her notes and observations. The fog, the new guard, and the hidden opportunities had all been challenges, yet each had provided lessons in strategy, patience, and subtle action. She realized that every obstacle, no matter how small or unexpected, could be navigated through careful thought, courage, and trust in her partner. The Alpha King, watching from the tower, considered the unseen dangers that could arise in the coming days. He knew that challenges would continue, yet he was confident in the young woman's growth and in their ability to coordinate under pressure. The first tests had proven that even powerlessness could be transformed into influence through careful observation, patience, and subtle courage. By the end of the week, they had refined their system further. The new guards' routines were mapped, blind spots identified, and subtle signals perfected. Each day, their coordination became smoother, their trust deeper, and their understanding of one another more intuitive. Unseen dangers, once a source of fear, had become opportunities for learning and growth as the young woman lay down to rest. She reflected on the lessons of the day. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was the ability to act thoughtfully despite it. Patience, observation, and subtle communication were powerful tools, and even the smallest actions could influence outcomes in meaningful ways. She had faced unseen dangers and emerged more confident, more capable, and more aware of her growing strength. Inside the tower, the Alpha King remained vigilant, amber eyes scanning the village and surrounding landscape. He understood that their journey was far from over, yet the young woman had proven herself capable of adapting, observing, and acting under pressure. Even in captivity, he had found a partner whose courage, intelligence, and subtle influence could shape the path forward, and so the days continued, marked by challenges, unseen dangers, and careful coordination. Together, they had built a silent rhythm of trust, courage, and observation, a partnership capable of navigating uncertainty, influencing outcomes, and preparing for the challenges yet to come. The young woman was no longer merely an observer. She had become a strategic ally, a partner in courage, and a source of hope in the Alpha King's captivity. The fog lifted completely as dawn approached, revealing the village in clear light. Though danger remained, and the path ahead was uncertain, both the Alpha King and the young woman understood that courage, trust, and careful action could guide them through any challenge. Unseen dangers could be anticipated, obstacles overcome, and powerlessness transformed into subtle influence. The silent partnership, forged through courage, patience, and observation, was now resilient. Each day's lessons strengthened their bond, each subtle act reinforced trust, and each success demonstrated that even in captivity, thoughtful action and quiet courage could shape the future. The sun rose over the ruined village, casting a gentle warmth across broken rooftops and shattered streets. The young woman moved with quiet purpose, her steps deliberate, her eyes alert. Each day had brought challenges, small victories, and lessons in courage, observation, and subtle strategy. Yet the events of the previous days had taught her one invaluable truth. Trust was the foundation of any plan. No matter how carefully crafted, she approached the tower with care, noting the positions and routines of the guards. Every detail mattered. Every glance, pause, and minor movement could be the difference between success and failure. Over time, she had learned to anticipate patterns, adjust to changes, and act with precision. But today, her focus was not only on careful action, it was on reinforcing the trust she and the Alpha King had cultivated through silent communication. Inside the tower, the Alpha King's amber eyes scanned the courtyard. He had observed her growth and independence with quiet approval. The subtle nods, careful notes, and small acts of courage she had executed over the past days were proof that she could be relied upon. Yet trust, he knew, was not static. It had to be nurtured, tested, and strengthened through shared understanding and cooperation. The young woman knelt at the base of the tower, slipping a small gift and a folded note through the gap at the bottom of the bars. The note outlined a minor adjustment to their coordination, a small timing change to account for the new guard's patrol pattern. She watched from the shadows, waiting for his response. Heart quickened with anticipation. The Alpha King read the note carefully, noting her thoughtful observations. He responded with a subtle gesture, a piece of cloth folded in a specific way to indicate approval and acknowledgement. Though simple, the gesture carried immense weight. It signaled trust, understanding, and the validation of her role in their shared strategy. For the rest of the morning, they engaged in a series of small, coordinated actions. The young woman created minor distractions, observed outcomes, and left notes indicating changes in guard behavior. The Alpha King responded by subtly shifting his position, adjusting his own actions based on her observations, and reinforcing the rhythm of silent communication. Through these small acts, trust deepened. She began to anticipate his responses, and he began to predict her decisions. Each successful coordination strengthened their bond, demonstrating that reliability, patience, and careful observation were as valuable as physical strength. Even without spoken words, they were learning to depend on each other. In the early afternoon, an unexpected complication arose. A pair of guards approached simultaneously, one of whom had recently joined the patrol. The young woman froze, heart racing, unsure if she could maintain the subtle coordination they had developed. She glanced at the Alpha King, who met her gaze with calm, amber eyes. A slight tilt of his head reassured her. "Stay composed, trust your training, and act with care." She responded with precise timing, creating a soft distraction that drew one guard's attention away while leaving the other unaware. The Alpha King shifted slightly, taking advantage of the moment to adjust his position in the tower. The coordination was flawless. Trust had been tested and reaffirmed, and the young woman felt a surge of pride and confidence. By late afternoon, they had established a pattern of cooperation that extended beyond mere survival. Each day's activities reinforced their understanding of one another, how to respond under pressure, how to anticipate actions, and how to execute plans with precision. Through patience, courage, and careful observation, they were building a foundation not only for strategy, but for partnership. The young woman realized that trust required vulnerability. She had to expose herself to risk, rely on his guidance, and act even when the outcome was uncertain. Each successful action reinforced her confidence, while each minor misstep provided a lesson in patience and adaptation. Over time, the Alpha King had become not only a leader, but a mentor, guiding her growth and reinforcing the value of trust through subtle, deliberate gestures. Inside the tower, the Alpha King reflected on her development. She had demonstrated courage, intelligence, and reliability qualities that made her indispensable to the plan. Yet trust was not simply about competence. It was about shared understanding, mutual respect, and the knowledge that each could rely on the other in moments of uncertainty. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that their silent partnership had grown into a dependable alliance. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, the young woman lingered near the tower. She left a small token of sustenance and a note expressing her observations and suggestions for the next day. In her mind, trust was no longer an abstract concept, was tangible, demonstrated in each coordinated action, each careful observation, and each thoughtful decision. The Alpha King retrieved the note and studied her insights. He saw not only the accuracy of her observations, but also the thoughtfulness behind each decision. Her growth was evident. She was no longer timid, no longer merely reactive. She had become proactive, strategic, and reliable, a true partner. Amber eyes met the note with approval and a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Trust had been built through consistent, deliberate actions, and it now formed the cornerstone of their shared strategy. Over the next several days, trust became the guiding principle of their interactions. They refined the timing of each approach, the placement of notes, and the subtle signals used to coordinate action. Each adjustment strengthened their understanding of one another, deepened their confidence, and enhanced the reliability of their partnership. The young woman began to anticipate challenges before they arose. Recognizing patterns in guard behavior and environmental changes, she adjusted her actions preemptively, leaving notes and minor signals that guided the Alpha King without exposing her position. Each successful maneuver reinforced the lessons of trust, patience, and careful observation. The Alpha King, in turn, continued to guide her subtly. He introduced minor challenges to test her judgment, observed her responses, and provided feedback through gestures and signals. Each test strengthened the trust between them, proving that even in captivity, reliance on a thoughtful ally could create opportunities for influence and eventual success. One evening, as the village lay bathed in moonlight, they executed a series of coordinated actions that demonstrated the depth of their trust. She created small distractions, observed guard behavior, and adjusted her position according to the signals he provided. The Alpha King responded with precision, using the opportunities created by her actions to refine his strategy and strengthen their position. The success of these maneuvers was not measured in immediate outcomes, but in the seamless coordination and understanding that had been achieved through these shared experiences. The young woman learned that trust was not static, it was nurtured, tested, and reinforced through consistent, thoughtful action. Courage, observation, and reliability were the currency of trust. and each day's activities contributed to a growing sense of mutual reliance. By the end of the week, a deep bond had formed between them. Trust was no longer fragile. It had become a resilient foundation for cooperation, strategy, and shared purpose. Even without spoken words, they had learned to anticipate, respond, and support one another in ways that transcended the limitations of captivity. The young woman returned to her shelter, reflecting on the lessons of the day. She had learned that trust required patience, courage, and careful observation. It was built not through grand gestures or declarations, but through consistent, thoughtful action. She had grown into a capable, reliable partner, and the Alpha King had become a mentor, guide, and source of reassurance in the face of uncertainty inside the tower. The Alpha King watched the village below, amber eyes thoughtful. He recognized her growth, resilience, and intelligence. Trust had been earned, nurtured, and strengthened through shared experience, and he knew that their partnership could now withstand unforeseen challenges and obstacles. Even in captivity, they had created a bond that was strong, strategic, and dependable. As night fell, the village lay quiet under the stars, yet within the shadows, a partnership flourished. Trust had been established, courage cultivated, and understanding deepened. The young woman was no longer merely an observer. She was a trusted ally, capable of influencing outcomes and contributing meaningfully to the Alpha King's strategy. Together, through patience, careful action, and mutual reliance, they had built a foundation of trust that would guide them through the challenges to come. Each day reinforced their bond, each successful coordination strengthened their confidence, and each act of courage demonstrated that even the powerless could wield meaningful influence through trust, observation, and thoughtful action. The early morning mist hung low over the village, wrapping the ruins in a grey, almost dreamlike veil. The young woman moved carefully through the debris, each step deliberate and measured. The previous weeks had taught her many lessons: courage, observation, subtle coordination, but today would test her patience like never before. From inside the tower, the Alpha King's amber eyes scanned the courtyard. He had noted the same mist and the way it obscured the familiar landmarks that had guided their previous attempts. Even the slightest shift in guard routines could spell disaster, and the fog made observation more challenging. He knew that patience, more than any other virtue, would determine whether today's actions succeeded. The young woman approached the tower cautiously, clutching her notebook and basket. She knelt at the base, slipping the morning's offerings and a folded note through the gap at the bottom of the bars. The note contained instructions for minor coordinated actions, designed to test timing, observation, and restraint. She waited in the shadows, feeling the tension of anticipation, aware that any rush, any impatience, could be catastrophic. The Alpha King read the note carefully, amber eyes sharp with focus. He understood immediately that patience would be the true test, not quick action, but the ability to remain calm, anticipate challenges, and respond only when the time was right. The first challenge came swiftly. One of the guards, new to the post, lingered near her hiding spot, scanning the debris with sharp, suspicious eyes. Panic rose in her chest, threatening to undo her careful planning. But she remembered the Alpha King's guidance: act thoughtfully, remain composed, and trust in the rhythm of their coordination. She waited, breathing slowly, watching the guard's movements, and resisting the urge to act prematurely. Inside the tower, the Alpha King shifted slightly, signaling subtly with a tilt of his head and the narrowing of his eyes. The young woman understood immediately. Patience was required. The guard would move away soon, and only then could she proceed. Minutes stretched like hours, yet she remained still, every nerve alert, every sense focused on observation. Finally, the guard moved on, leaving the area clear. Relief flooded through her, tempered by the awareness that patience had been the key to success. She left the small rock as a minor distraction, allowing the Alpha King to adjust his position within the tower. Though the movement was small, it reinforced the lesson. Patience, careful timing, and trust were more powerful than haste or boldness. Over the next several hours, the young woman executed a series of delicate maneuvers. She observed guard rotations, noted shifts in routine, and left subtle signals for the Alpha King. Each action required restraint, careful thought, and anticipation of the guard's behavior. The fog, the new patrols, and the complexity of the environment tested her resolve. Yet she relied on patience and the growing rhythm of their partnership. By mid-afternoon, another complication arose. A sudden change in the guard's schedule meant that the timing of their coordinated actions had to be adjusted on the fly. The young woman paused, her heart racing, uncertain of how to respond. But the Alpha King's amber eyes met hers through the window, calm and focused. A subtle gesture, a piece of cloth, folded in a precise manner, indicated the adjustments needed. She waited, observing the guard's new positions, calculating the safest moment to proceed. When the opportunity finally arrived, she executed the coordinated actions flawlessly. Minor distractions, notes indicating new paths, and careful observation of the Alpha King's responses. Patience had guided her, ensuring that their strategy remained intact despite unexpected changes. The lessons of the day were clear. Patience was not passive, was active, requiring observation, calculation, and the ability to resist impulsive action. Courage remained vital, but without restraint and thoughtfulness, even the bravest actions could result in failure. She began to understand that patience, observation, and trust were intertwined, forming the foundation of their subtle partnership. By evening, the village lay quiet beneath the setting sun. The young woman reflected on the day's events, realizing that her growth extended beyond courage and observation. She had learned the power of waiting, of thinking ahead, and of acting only when the time was right. Each successful maneuver reinforced the value of patience, and each challenge tested her ability to maintain composure under pressure. Inside the tower, the Alpha King reviewed the day's movements. He noted her careful execution, the subtle adjustments she had made, and the restraint she had demonstrated. Patience, he recognized, was a skill that could not be rushed. It was cultivated through repeated practice, observation, and thoughtful action. She had learned it well, and their silent coordination had never been stronger. The night brought stillness, yet both of them remained vigilant. Patience, they realized, would be required not only for immediate actions, but for the long-term success of their strategy. Every decision, every movement, had to be measured, considered, and executed at the precise moment. The young woman's growth in this regard was as significant as her courage, intelligence, and reliability. They began to refine their signals further, introducing subtle cues that accounted for delays, distractions, and unforeseen complications. The young woman practiced restraint, waiting for the exact moment to act, while the Alpha King continued to guide her through subtle gestures and adjustments. Together, they built a rhythm of patience and timing, strengthening their coordination and trust. The young woman understood that patience was not merely about waiting. It was about understanding the environment, anticipating obstacles, and choosing the right moment to act. Each successful application reinforced her confidence, deepened her understanding of strategy, and strengthened the bond with the Alpha King. Even powerlessness could be transformed into influence when guided by careful observation, trust, and patience. By the end of the night, the young woman had completed a full day of tests, maneuvers, and adjustments without incident. Each challenge had been met with calm, thoughtful action, and each successful coordination had reinforced her growing abilities. She felt a sense of pride and accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that patience, rather than haste, was the key to their shared strategy. Inside the tower, the Alpha King noted the subtle cues she had left, the careful timing of each action, and the restraint she had demonstrated under pressure. He understood that patience was as essential as courage, and that her ability to act thoughtfully and deliberately made her an invaluable partner. Even in captivity, their partnership had grown stronger through careful coordination, observation, and trust. As dawn approached, the village lay quiet beneath the first light of day. The young woman reflected on the lessons learned. Patience was an active skill. Courage was strengthened by restraint, and trust was reinforced through consistent, thoughtful action. Each day brought new challenges, yet each challenge was an opportunity to grow, learn, and strengthen the silent partnership that had become the foundation of their strategy. Together, through careful observation, thoughtful action, and the disciplined exercise of patience, they had built a resilient rhythm of cooperation and trust. The young woman had learned to wait, to observe, and to act only when the time was right, transforming fear and powerlessness into measured influence. The Alpha King had found in her not only courage and intelligence, but the rare ability to exercise patience under pressure, skill that would prove invaluable in the days to come. And so, the test of patience concluded successfully. Each obstacle had been navigated, each risk mitigated, and each act of courage carefully timed. The young woman had grown stronger, wiser, and more confident, and their silent partnership had deepened into a foundation capable of supporting even greater challenges ahead. The sun rose over the village, casting a warm, golden glow across the broken rooftops and scattered debris. The young woman moved with quiet purpose, her eyes scanning every detail, every movement of the guards. She had grown accustomed to the routine, yet each day brought new challenges. And today was different. Today would mark their first subtle victory, a small but meaningful demonstration of their growing coordination and trust. Inside the tower, the Alpha King's amber eyes followed her every move. He had noted the meticulous care she took in her approach, the precise timing of her actions, and the careful placement of her notes. Her growth had been remarkable. She was no longer merely reactive, but proactive, anticipating challenges and adjusting her strategy accordingly. Today, he knew, their planning would begin to bear fruit. She knelt at the base of the tower, slipping the morning's offerings and a folded note through the gap at the bottom of the bars. The note outlined a coordinated action, a series of minor distractions designed to test the guard's attention, creating an opening for the Alpha King to adjust his position slightly and observe weaknesses in the tower's structure. It was a small maneuver, yet it carried significant meaning. They were moving beyond observation and planning into subtle execution. The Alpha King read the note carefully. He recognized the opportunity within her instructions and prepared to act. Though constrained by chains, his movements were deliberate, measured, and precise. He shifted slightly, creating subtle changes in posture that would be important for the next stage of their plan. The trust between them allowed these coordinated actions to unfold seamlessly. The first distraction was simple, but effective. She tossed a small pebble onto a distant pile of rubble, drawing the attention of a nearby guard. He paused, glanced toward the sound, and continued on his path, unaware of the deeper coordination at play. The Alpha King responded immediately, using the moment to adjust his position within the tower and observe a previously hidden weakness in the wall, a small crack near the base that could eventually serve as a point of opportunity. Over the next hour, they repeated the sequence: small distractions, careful observation, and subtle adjustments. Each successful maneuver reinforced the rhythm of their coordination and the trust that had developed between them. For the first time, they experienced the tangible result of their efforts, not a dramatic escape or confrontation, but the quiet satisfaction of seeing their planning manifest in meaningful action. The young woman felt a surge of pride. She had been patient, observant, and precise, and the Alpha King had responded with guidance and insight. Together, they had created a minor but significant advantage, demonstrating that, even in captivity, careful strategy and subtle coordination could influence outcomes. It was a reminder that small victories were often the foundation for greater success. By midday, they had identified additional weaknesses in the tower's structure, noted guard behavior, and refined their signals for future coordination. Each observation was recorded in her notebook, meticulously documented for future reference. The Alpha King's guidance had been invaluable, yet it was her courage, intelligence, and patience that had made the subtle victory possible. In the late afternoon, a new challenge presented itself. A guard, unfamiliar with the previous routines, approached, pausing near her hiding place. The young woman froze, aware that a misstep could compromise their subtle success. She glanced at the Alpha King, whose amber eyes met hers with calm reassurance. A slight tilt of his head indicated the correct course of action. Remain patient. Observe and act only when the opportunity presented itself. She waited, heart racing, until the guard moved on. Then, with precise timing, she executed a minor distraction, allowing the Alpha King to shift his position further and observe another, witness a loose stone near the corner of the tower that could be instrumental in future maneuvers. It was another small victory, yet each step reinforced the importance of patience, observation, and coordination. By evening, the young woman and the Alpha King had completed a series of actions that marked the first tangible success of their planning. They had influenced guard behavior, identified structural weaknesses, and refined their signals for future coordination. The subtle victory was not dramatic, but it was meaningful, proof that even in captivity, careful strategy, patience, and trust could create opportunities. The young woman returned to her shelter, reflecting on the lessons of the day. Courage and intelligence had been important, but the subtle victory had been achieved through patience, careful observation, and trust in her partner. She realized that even small successes could have a lasting impact, building confidence, strengthening bonds, and creating the foundation for future progress. Inside the tower, the Alpha King reviewed the day's events. Amber eyes followed the movements she had documented, noting her careful timing, precision, and insight. He recognized that their subtle victory was a significant milestone, not for its immediate consequences, but for the reinforcement of trust, the demonstration of capability, and the tangible proof that their coordination was effective. The night brought a quiet reflection. The young woman studied her notes and prepared for the next day, reviewing observations, adjusting signals, and considering potential challenges. She understood that subtle victories were built on preparation, patience, and consistent effort. Each success, no matter how minor, was a step toward greater freedom, greater influence, and greater understanding. The Alpha King, watching the village below from his tower, allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had been confined, restrained, and under constant observation, yet their coordinated efforts had produced results. He had found in the young woman a partner capable of strategic thought, courage, and patience, a combination that could alter the course of their shared journey. Over the following days, they continued to refine their coordination. Subtle victories became more frequent. A guard distracted at the right moment, a note delivered undetected, a weakness in the tower identified and documented. Each success reinforced their confidence, strengthened their bond, and demonstrated that even small deliberate actions could have meaningful consequences. The young woman realized that the subtle victory was more than a demonstration of skill, it was a test of resilience, focus, and trust. Courage, intelligence, and patience had been required in equal measure. She had grown more confident in her ability to influence events, more precise in her timing, and more aware of the value of careful coordination. Inside the tower, the Alpha King reflected on the partnership that had been forged through subtle victories, patience, and trust. He had found a reliable ally in the young woman, someone capable of observing, anticipating, and acting with precision. Even in captivity, they had begun to shape their environment and create opportunities that could eventually lead to freedom. As dawn approached, the village lay quiet under a soft golden light. The young woman prepared for the next day, reviewing observations, refining signals, and considering new challenges. She had learned that subtle victories were cumulative, that patience and observation were as important as courage, and that trust was strengthened through consistent, deliberate action, together through careful coordination, patience, and the recognition of small but meaningful successes. They had achieved their first subtle victory. It was not a dramatic escape or confrontation, but it was proof that even in captivity, careful strategy, thoughtful action, and mutual trust could shape outcomes, influence behavior, and create opportunities for future success. The silent partnership, forged through courage, patience, and observation, had begun to yield tangible results. Each subtle victory reinforced confidence, each successful coordination strengthened trust, and each careful maneuver demonstrated that even powerlessness could be transformed into meaningful influence. By the end of the day, both the young woman and the Alpha King understood that they were no longer merely surviving. They were progressing, learning, and shaping the path ahead. The subtle victory had been achieved not through force, but through courage, intelligence, patience, and the unwavering trust that had been cultivated between them. And so, their journey continued, marked by small victories, careful planning, and the deepening partnership that would guide them through the challenges yet to come. The Alpha King had found in her a true ally, and the young woman had discovered that even the smallest successes could have a lasting, transformative impact. The morning sun filtered gently through the remnants of the village, casting a warm glow over shattered rooftops and broken streets. The young woman moved with quiet determination, notebook in hand, basket of supplies balanced carefully. Each day had brought small victories, lessons in patience, and moments of trust, but today felt different. Today, she sensed that a turning point had arrived, an opportunity to transform their careful planning into something more significant. Inside the tower, the Alpha King's amber eyes scanned the courtyard. He had observed the villagers' routines for weeks, noting guard rotations, blind spots, and subtle weaknesses in the structure. He understood that their previous successes, while small, had built the foundation for this moment. The turning point was not an escape, nor a confrontation. It was the realization that subtle coordination, trust, and patience had created a new kind of influence over their environment. The young woman approached the tower with deliberate care, noting every movement of the guards. She slipped the morning offerings and a folded note through the gap at the bottom of the bars. The note outlined a coordinated series of minor distractions and observations designed to test both her judgment and the Alpha King's response under a slightly more complex scenario. He read the note carefully, amber eyes sharp and calculating. The instructions were precise, yet open enough to allow for independent decisions. He understood immediately that the turning point lay not in the mechanics of the plan, but in their ability to trust, anticipate, and act in harmony. It was a subtle shift from cautious practice to deliberate influence, The first challenge appeared almost immediately. A group of guards, larger than usual, moved through the courtyard. Their presence could have caused panic, yet the young woman remained composed. She observed their movements, calculated timing, and waited for the exact moment to act. Patience, she had learned, was often more powerful than boldness. She initiated a minor distraction, tossing a small pebble to draw attention away from her position. One guard paused, glanced toward the sound, and continued on his path. The Alpha King responded within seconds, shifting slightly and noting a previously overlooked weakness in the tower wall, a crack that extended higher than they had realized. Even confined, he had begun to recognize opportunities that could be exploited with careful observation and coordination. Throughout the morning, they continued their coordinated maneuvers. The young woman left subtle signals and minor notes, while the Alpha King adjusted his position and observed structural vulnerabilities. Each success reinforced their growing confidence and the realization that their actions could meaningfully influence their surroundings. By midday, a new development challenged their progress. The guards had altered their routine unexpectedly, introducing a patrol pattern that required rapid adaptation. The young woman paused, assessing the situation carefully. Her heart raced, but she reminded herself of the lessons learned: patience, observation, and trust. Acting hastily could jeopardize everything. The Alpha King, observing from within the tower, signaled subtly. A tilt of the head, a shift of the hand, a glance all conveyed instructions without exposing their coordination. She adjusted her actions accordingly, creating minor distractions and leaving notes that accounted for the altered patrol. The plan unfolded smoothly, demonstrating their ability to adapt and respond as a team. The turning point became clearer as the day progressed. Each successful maneuver was no longer just a test, it was a statement of capability. They had moved beyond simple observation and minor victories. Now, they were influencing outcomes, shaping the environment, and preparing for the next stage of their strategy. The young woman realized that their silent coordination had transformed them from passive observers into active participants. By late afternoon, another opportunity presented itself. A loose stone in the base of the tower wall, previously unnoticed, offered a potential leverage point. The young woman documented the finding in her notebook and left a note for the Alpha King, outlining her observations and suggestions for its use. He studied the note carefully, recognizing the significance. Even small structural insights could be critical in the future. They spent the evening refining their coordination. Signals were adjusted, notes placed strategically, and minor distractions planned in advance. The young woman felt a growing sense of empowerment. She was no longer merely executing instructions, but contributing meaningfully to strategy and planning. Her confidence had grown, tempered by patience, observation, and trust. Inside the tower, the Alpha King allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had been captured, restrained, and isolated. Yet through careful planning and coordination, they had begun to shift the balance of influence. He recognized the young woman's growth, courage, intelligence, patience, and the ability to act under pressure. The turning point was not a single dramatic event, but the cumulative realization that their partnership had evolved into a capable, strategic alliance. Dusk settled over the village. They executed a final series of coordinated actions for the day. Minor distractions, careful observation, and subtle signals all came together seamlessly. Each movement, each gesture, reinforced trust and demonstrated the power of careful, deliberate action. The young woman marveled at how far they had come, from timid observation to meaningful influence. That night, she reflected on the lessons learned. Courage, intelligence, and patience had been critical, but trust had become the linchpin of their success. She understood that the turning point was not about immediate freedom or confrontation, but about realizing their potential to influence, observe, and plan strategically. Each subtle victory had built toward this moment, and now the future felt full of possibility. The Alpha King, watching the village below, mirrored her reflection. He understood that their partnership had evolved beyond necessity, was now a bond forged through trust, shared strategy, and mutual respect. Even in captivity, they had found a way to assert influence, shape outcomes, and prepare for future opportunities. The turning point was a quiet affirmation of their growing strength and capability. By dawn, the village lay bathed in soft light. The young woman reviewed her notes, adjusted her signals, and prepared for the next series of coordinated actions. The turning point had been reached. Subtle victories, careful planning, and growing trust had transformed their efforts into meaningful influence. They were no longer merely surviving, they were shaping the environment and preparing for the challenges ahead. The young woman understood that progress, even subtle, required patience, observation, and courage. Each action, each decision, and each calculated risk had contributed to their turning point. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face the coming days with confidence and determination. Inside the tower, the Alpha King reflected on their journey. He had been cautious, patient, and strategic. Yet the young woman's growth and initiative had been instrumental in reaching this moment. Their silent partnership had matured, creating a foundation of trust, capability, and subtle influence. He allowed himself a rare sense of hope. They were now not just planning, but actively shaping the possibilities of the future. And so, the turning point had arrived not through confrontation, escape, or dramatic action, but through careful observation, coordinated strategy, and the quiet assertion of influence. Each subtle victory, each carefully timed maneuver, and each demonstration of trust had built toward this moment. Together, they had proven that even in captivity, patience, courage, and collaboration could create meaningful change. The village lay quiet beneath the first light of dawn. Yet within the ruins, a partnership had matured into a capable alliance. The Alpha King had found a reliable, thoughtful ally, and the young woman had discovered that even subtle actions could have significant impact. The turning point was complete. The path forward was clearer, the partnership stronger, and the possibilities of future success real. The first light of dawn spread gently over the village, painting the ruins in soft gold and silver hues. The young woman stood at the edge of the courtyard, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the familiar ruins with a sense of quiet purpose. Each morning had brought small victories, lessons in patience, and moments of trust, but today felt different. Today, every careful step, every coordinated action, every subtle victory would culminate in a moment that neither she nor the Alpha King could forget. Inside the tower, the Alpha King moved with cautious precision. His amber eyes followed her through the rising light, noting the exact timing of her steps and the placement of her notes. They had spent weeks building trust, coordinating actions, and testing the boundaries of possibility. Today, that trust would carry them further than ever before. The young woman knelt at the base of the tower and left a folded note with the morning's small offerings. This note was different. It outlined a culmination of all the strategies, observations, and subtle manipulations they had practiced. It was a roadmap of patience, courage, and trust, designed not merely to survive, but to assert influence over their world and shape their own destiny. The Alpha King read the note with intense focus, recognizing immediately the significance. Each step was deliberate, each action accounted for, and the subtle cues within it demonstrated not only her growth, but the evolution of their partnership. This was more than coordination. It was a shared vision, a silent understanding that they were no longer powerless in the face of captivity. The morning progressed with precise execution. Guards followed their usual routes, unaware of the careful timing, minor distractions, and subtle signals that guided the Alpha King's shifts within the tower. Every movement, every glance, every adjustment reinforced the bond they had forged. Trust had become second nature, and courage had been tempered by patience and observation. By mid-morning, an opportunity emerged that would have seemed impossible weeks before. A section of the tower wall, weakened and overlooked, offered the Alpha King a chance to test the effectiveness of their coordination. The young woman had marked it in her notebook days earlier, a small insight that now held the potential for meaningful impact. She signaled subtly, using gestures and small movements that only he could recognize. Amber eyes met hers, conveying understanding and resolve. Carefully, he shifted, testing the crack in the wall, noting its resilience and potential. This small act, unseen by the guards, was a quiet but powerful demonstration of their growing influence, proof that patience, strategy, and trust could shape outcomes even under constraint. The day continued with a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Each small victory, each subtle action, reinforced their connection. The young woman observed, documented, and guided. The Alpha King responded, adapted, and executed. The pattern was flawless, a silent symphony of courage, intelligence, and trust that had been cultivated over countless days of careful planning. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ruins. They had achieved more than minor victories. They had demonstrated influence, built confidence, and established the possibility of change. The young woman felt a swell of emotion, pride, determination, and a profound sense of connection with the Alpha King. She had begun as an observer, timid and cautious, but now she was a partner, a strategist, and a source of hope. Inside the tower, the Alpha King reflected on her growth. He had witnessed her courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering patience, and he understood that their partnership had reached a turning point. He had been captive, restrained, and limited in power, yet together they had shaped the environment, influenced outcomes, and discovered the transformative potential of trust. As dusk settled, a final moment of coordination arrived. The young woman executed the last planned distraction of the day, drawing the guard's attention away from the section of the tower wall she had marked. The Alpha King moved with careful precision, testing the weak spot and confirming its potential. It was a subtle victory, yes, but it carried the weight of all their accumulated effort, a moment that would pave the way for even greater achievements. When the guards eventually moved on, oblivious to the quiet orchestration that had unfolded, the young woman and the Alpha King shared a silent acknowledgement. No words were spoken. None were needed. Their partnership had matured into something deeper, something unspoken yet profoundly understood. Trust, patience, courage, and intelligence had culminated in a shared triumph. A quiet assertion of agency in a world that had once seemed impossible to influence. That night, as the stars emerged over the village, the young woman reflected on the journey. She had begun with fear, timidity, and uncertainty, yet through observation, careful planning, and unwavering trust in the Alpha King, she had discovered her own strength. Each subtle victory had shaped her, each coordinated action had strengthened the bond between them. And now the dawn of freedom felt closer than ever. Inside the tower, the Alpha King's amber eyes gazed at the night sky. He had been confined, restrained, and powerless, yet the young woman's courage, intelligence, and patience had transformed their situation. Together, they had moved from survival to influence, from observation to strategy. The turning point had been reached, and the possibility of real change had become tangible. As dawn approached, the young woman approached the tower one final time. She left her notebook and a small offering, knowing that the Alpha King had already understood the culmination of their plan. Every subtle action, every careful distraction, and every moment of trust had led to this moment. The village, once a place of ruins and fear, now held the promise of transformation. The Alpha King watched her from the tower window, amber eyes filled with respect and admiration. He had seen her courage, her patience, and her unwavering commitment, and he understood that their shared victories, small, subtle, and deliberate, had forged a bond stronger than chains or walls. Their partnership was complete, their trust unbreakable, and their influence undeniable. The dawn arrived in full, casting warm light across the village. The young woman and the Alpha King stood apart, yet united, each aware of the silent triumph they had achieved together. The journey had been long, filled with obstacles, patience, and subtle victories. Yet now the horizon seemed open, filled with possibility and hope. As they gazed at the rising sun, the young woman felt a rush of emotion, relief, and a deep, abiding sense of connection. The Alpha King, in turn, felt a rare moment of fulfillment. He had been captive, restrained, and uncertain. Yet together they had discovered the power of trust, patience, and strategic action. And then, in that quiet, radiant dawn, a thought settled over them both, a hook that would linger in the hearts of anyone who witnessed it. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was a path, carefully illuminated by every subtle victory, every act of trust, and every shared moment of courage. The young woman had grown into a strategist, a partner, and a source of hope. The Alpha King had discovered in her a true ally, capable of shaping the future alongside him. And as the sun rose fully, bathing the ruins in golden light, they realized that the journey was far from over. The dawn of freedom had arrived not as a grand escape, but as a promise that courage, trust, patience, and careful action could transform even the darkest circumstances. And somewhere in the quiet of that golden morning, a single thought echoed in both of their hearts. The world had changed for them, but the story was only beginning.